Welcome back. The president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, says his country has developed a new weapon which can hit targets as much as 700 kilometres away. Well, only yesterday, Kyiv launched a series of aerial attacks deep inside Russian territory, inflicting damage on Russian military transport planes. Well, all the while, the Ukrainian counteroffensive is continuing, and officials in Kyiv say it is managing to chip away at the front line. But for those who say the counteroffensive is progressing too slowly, the Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba had strong words. He told his critics to, and I quote, shut up, and to try coming to Ukraine and having a go themselves. Well, let's get some more analysis. We can speak now to Dr. Samuel Ramani, who is Associate Fellow at the Royal United Services Institute and also the author of Putin's War on Ukraine, Russia's Campaign for Global Counter-Revolution. Thank you very much indeed for joining us once again, Dr. Ramani. I'd just like to start by asking you, what's your reading of Ukraine's progress in the counteroffensive?
Well, Ukraine seems to be gaining a bit of momentum on the southern axis. They did capture Robotnae, and now they're moving closer and closer to their goal, which is to eventually march on Tokmak and on the Sea of Azov. And because they want to reach the Sea of Azov, because if they get there, they'll be able to bifurcate the Russian forces. That's still a long way away and may not happen until 2024, but we're seeing some gradual gains in the southern direction.
Right, and as they head south, I mean, do you think Crimea is a long shot, as a longer-term goal for the Ukrainians?
Well, Crimea is certainly going to be a goal that Ukraine is going to ultimately pursue taking over. But for right now, I think it's an unrealistic one because they have to take over Zaporizhzhia Oblast first. However, that does not preclude an expansion and intensification of Ukrainian drone and long-range strikes on the Crimean Peninsula. We've been seeing regular shoot-downs of Ukrainian drones over there, as well as attacks on the Kerch Bridge. So I think that Ukraine will probably engage in that kind of activity and also trying to foment partisan unrest in Crimea. We're seeing protests, for example, against the universal draft that Russia is imposing on Crimean citizens.
Just listening to what the Foreign Minister of Ukraine said earlier on today, obviously his country not happy about being told it's taking too long. This counteroffensive isn't taking long enough. What do you think is holding up? What are the main obstacles that the Ukrainians are facing? Because some people watching will say they've got all this sophisticated weaponry. Why can't they get through those Russian lines?
Well, the problem is that the Russians devised fortifications called the Surovikin Line, named after the former general, basically from October, so after the loss in Kharkiv, on until basically the middle of the spring. So those lines consist of landmines, they consist of trenches, they consist of many layers of difficult terrain. The first line of defense has already been breached, the Ukrainians say, which means that the second and third lines are going to be a little bit less concentrated. But that's a major fortification hurdle to get over. Also, some of the equipment that Ukraine has asked for from NATO has come in quite a delayed fashion. We've seen Germany be quite responsive with the Leopard tanks, but the U.S. not being responsive with the Abrams tanks, for instance. And finally, the Russians have gotten better at jamming HIMARS systems, and they've also been able to use attack helicopters over the horizon and leverage their air power advantage. And Ukraine doesn't have F-16 jets yet and probably won't have them until the middle of 2024. So there's many reasons at play here. The strength of the fortifications and delayed Western equipment deliveries being the two most important ones.
When Kuleba, the foreign minister, made those comments in Spain, to whom do you think he was really directing that message in which he told his critics to, and I quote, shut up? Obviously, he's talking about people who've said that Ukraine's progress is too slow. Who's making those accusations?
Well, he could be directing it at a variety of places. I don't think necessarily any one. It could be some leaders within the European Union, like Viktor Orban, who is really pushing for a negotiated settlement right now that would effectively freeze conflict lines. We just saw Orban come out yesterday and say that if we produce more, the Russians will simply produce more. If we try to defeat Russia, the Russians will never give up. So what's the point in fighting? It could be people like that. It could also be some of the Republican presidential candidates who have been talking about freezing the conflict, like Donald Trump, Vivek Ramaswamy, or Ron DeSantis. And it could be also at some of the voices that we don't really see in public, but are kind of pushing for this within Germany, France, and even the United States, who believe that this counteroffensive is the big goal that Ukraine should have, and that we should reconsider support for Ukraine in 2024.
Yeah, because there have been polls in the United States that suggest that support for Ukraine is waning in some quarters at any rate. I mean, do you think there's a feeling in Ukraine that they're in a race against time for that reason as well? Namely, the goodwill from the United States and from other Western countries might not carry on beyond, let's say, the next election cycle.
Well, that's certainly something that they are worried about, even though they can't really admit that necessarily that publicly. And that's why I think Ukraine is investing a lot more in indigenous defense technology. Like, for example, Alexei Reznikov is trying to make the Ukrainian production of Turkish Bayraktar drones a model of something that could be used to produce other equipment. We have a Leopard tank repair center being built. Zelensky just announced that one of Ukraine's long-range weapons had a 700-kilometer radius of attack. So Ukraine will hedge on that by investing in indigenous weaponry and also trying to convey to Western allies the urgency of the situation. And I think that Zelensky will be able to corral many countries onto his side, including the majority of Republicans and Democrats in Congress. But whether the newly elected president of the United States follows that view or is willing to compromise with Congress on it is really an open question.
Now, in the last day or so, we've been talking about these Ukrainian attacks that have gone deep inside Russian territory, hundreds of kilometers away from Ukrainian soil. That's obviously an attempt, isn't it, to erode Russian morale, perhaps increase pressure on the Kremlin. I mean, do you think that's likely to work?
Well, I think it's aimed at bringing the war at home to the Russians, because the Russian people, aside from Bryansk, Kursk, and Belgorod, had not really experienced the war beyond the draft and beyond the casualties. Even those casualties in the draft didn't hit Moscow and St. Petersburg anywhere near as strong as it hit ethnic minority regions in the poorest regions of the country. So this is aimed, in particular, at getting all the Russians to feel that they are in a state of war, and they're hoping that that creates discord inside Russia, recriminations, bickering, something along the lines of what we saw between Prigozhin and the Russian Ministry of Defense. And that could happen, but it could also cut the other way in terms of rallying Russians around the flag right now, and particularly with some of those ultra-nationalist voices like Gherkin in prison, Surovikin fired, Prigozhin dead. It might actually end up having the reverse effect and actually galvanizing Russians at this time.
And just lastly, I wanted to ask you about the absence, or at least the confusion in the ranks of Wagner there in Ukraine. How much of a difference do you think that's likely to make on the battlefield?
Well, it's not going to have much of a difference in the battlefield in Ukraine right now. It may have an issue, obviously, in 2024, because there would have been a question as to whether Wagner would have rejoined the front lines in some kind of an offensive capacity. The Russians, even as they're doing counteroffensive defenses right now, they're trying to advance in the Kupiansk-Liman direction, and they would want to maybe gain more ground on that in the winter. But if Wagner becomes a unit of the Russian Ministry of Defense, some of those forces could return. But the problem is they'll be subjected to the Russian command structure, which doesn't allow for much ingenuity or creativity. So they may be back in person, but not really back in spirit.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Dr. Samuel Ramani, always great to have your insights. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.